What's up, class? Hope all is going well. And I hope you guys are holding up very well under the current conditions. So this week we're going to go over tone. And tone, the best way to, I guess, remember it is to say that tone deals with brightness and darkness of objects, right? The brightness and darkness of objects. And particularly on the grayscale. We have that grayscale right here, going from dark to the gray all the way up to white. Okay, so what we're looking at now is how do we control tone during production? How do we control the grayscale? Well, according to the book, we have three different ways. Okay, we have reflective control, incident control, and then exposure. Okay, so reflective control is this. Every object, okay, light waves, white light contains every color in the rainbow. And when that color, let's say here's an object, a cup, right? So that color, that light is hitting this object, and a certain wavelength of light, of color, is bouncing off of it, right? It's reflected off of it. And that has to do with the pigments, the dyes in the object, right? Like, for example, my shirt looks kind of like a baby bluish color, or the wall behind me looks like a greenish color. Okay, there are paints and pigments in dyes in the shirt and on the wall that absorb the reds and the blues, but reflects the blues and the greens. Okay, I'm sorry, it absorbs the reds and yellows, but reflects the blues and the greens. So the light, the white light, hits the fabric, absorbs certain colors, but other colors bounce off of it. What our eyes see are the colors that are bouncing off of it, reflecting off of it. That's why it's called reflective control, right? We control what light reflects off of it and the color of that light, right? So for reflective control, we're looking at art direction. Okay, so we want to have control over things like the painting of the set, the colors of the fabric that the characters are wearing on a certain scene, the colors of objects like props, chairs, and stuff like that in a scene. We want to control those colors, those reflections coming off of that. So that's reflective control. Now, by doing that, we can create masterpieces. Like here's an example of reflective control. Notice how everyone is wearing this dark black, that same drab black, drab gray. Okay. Here's another example where everyone is wearing bright colors, white, and they have the plates being waved around, right? So they're controlling the tone of the shot with reflective control. Here's one, everyone's wearing black. Okay, so it's reflecting darker colors. Okay. So if your scene requires a dark look, you paint your set dark. You dress everyone in dark clothing. If your scene requires a bright look, you paint your set bright. You put in bright props, bright objects, and you dress everyone in brighter colors, brighter fabrics. Okay? Okay. I'm reading directly from the book now, page 121. If reflective tone is going to be used for an entire production, all the lighting must be shadowless and flat. There should be the same amount of light everywhere because the grayscale will be controlled by the actual brightness value of the objects, not by the lighting. So we light everything evenly, right? And we allow the objects, the color of the objects, the brightness of the objects to sort of push the narrative, to push the visual. Hopefully that makes sense. So this puts the tone of the film in the hands of the art director, costume designer, prop designer, right? Because they have to match those colors that we want. Okay. The next one is incident control. Now, unlike reflective control, reflective, we're dealing with the colors of the objects, how they reflect certain lights, right? Incident control where we're controlling the tone or the brightness of the shot by the amount of light that we put on it and where we place the light. So a wall that's painted white can still appear dark if I'm putting it in the shadows. And so here we have an example of a couple examples of incident control. There's this one right here, where they're using the actual placement of the light to control the visuals of the image. Okay. Here's another example of incident control in outdoors, where we see the shadows coming from these bars up here on this railing and here on top. That's incident control. Reflective, this is reflective control, where the whole thing is lit evenly and we do not get any shadows. It's shadowless. Okay, so reflective control, shadowless. Incident control, we get shadows. Okay, incident control, you're controlling the light, right? Replacing the light in a specific place for a specific type of lighting, for a specific brightness. Whereas in reflective control, where you're using the reflective qualities of fabrics and dyes and pigments and the color of objects themselves to create that palette, that dark or bright palette. Okay. The third method is quite simple. It's exposure. And exposure happens inside of the camera. Okay. This type of control is less selective than reflective or incident. As camera shutters or the f-stop is adjusted, the entire picture will brighten or darken. Okay, so what for exposure, we're playing with what's called the f-stop, or the frame speed, shutter speed. The wider the shutter, the slower the speed, the more light it will let in. The faster the speed, the less light it will go in. So we can control how much exposure at any moment that a shot gets. That's called exposure control. And that happens inside the camera. And what that does is it darkens and lightens everything evenly. Okay? So here we have an example of a building, a photograph of a building. And the exposure is spot on, right? But for this one, we lighten the photo using the f-stop, using exposure. So this one, the image is brighter. Or we can darken the image using exposure. So in both of these, they lighten right here, or they darken all the colors evenly. That's exposure control, and that happens inside the camera. And it has to do with the f-stop. Okay? Now we have two other tones to refer to. And this refers to the relationship between the tonal organization of the shot and the subject in the shot. So right now we're looking at the organization of the entire shot and the subject of the shot. the main object in that shot. Okay? So we have two terms, coincidence and non-coincidence. Coincidence and non-coincidence of tone refers to the relationship between the tonal organization of the shot and the subject of the shot. Coincidence of tone occurs when the tonal range reveals the subject. Okay? That's coincidence, when we can see the subject like that. That's a coincidence. When the shot conceals the subject, that's non-coincidence, right? We get this silhouetted type of shot. That's non-coincidence. So we have coincidence where it reveals, non-coincidence where it conceals. So here we have the light. This is a representation of a photo where the light is actually on his face and we get facial details, which is coincidence. But here we don't have the light on his face where we miss the details. It's only silhouette, non-coincidence. So be able to make sure you can identify the difference between coincidence and non-coincidence. Coincidence, non-coincidence. Coincidence, the light is on the face and it illuminates the details. Non-coincidence, the light is not on the subject and we don't get those details. Okay? That's coincidence and non-coincidence of tone. Here's another example of coincidence. I'm sorry, this is non-coincidence. And coincidence. We don't see the subject. Okay? Even though the first two pictures are both silhouettes, one in coincidence and the other is non-coincidence. The actor standing in the doorway of the third picture may be in silhouette like the second, but the subject is not a face. The subject is a person standing in the doorway. Even though the person is well lighted, the audience couldn't see the face because the actor is too far away. The last picture is coincidence because the tonal organization clearly reveals the subject. So when the tonal organization reveals the subject, it's coincidence. Just remember that. When it's revealed, it's coincidence. When the tonal organization conceals the main object, it's non-coincidence. Very simple, very straightforward. If you have any questions, drop it in the discussion board and I'll be happy to answer, discuss it some more, make another video about it. All that good stuff. Okay, so here now he gives us some further examples using real life, using real images. So here we have coincidence where we see the images. We can see the subject clearly as defined by the lighting. And here we have non-coincidence where we don't see the faces of the subject. Okay? Two contrasting shots. Okay? Coincidence, non-coincidence. Coincidence, coincidence, non-coincidence. Okay? When it's concealed, it's non-coincidence. When it's revealed, it's coincidence. So this coincidence and non-coincidence comes into play. You can use it as far as, with the idea of affinity and contrast again. So in an affinity, you would have a contrast. With an affinity, you would have an even, you would have you would have an even tone. Whereas with the contrast, you may not have an even tone. For example, for affinity, here we have a grayscale. So let's say we want to create a shot where there's an affinity of gray. Then I can only use, let's say, 1, 2, 3, and 4, these 4 bright tones. But let's say if I want to create a contrast, I can say I'm going to use these 2 and these 2 over here. Sort of like this shot right here. There's a high contrast, all right? Or in this shot right here, high contrast. Now with this shot, there is not a high contrast, as you can see. There's an affinity of tone because the color palette has been restricted. I'm sorry, the tonal palette has been restricted to, let's say, like between here and here, to a third. See that? That's an affinity, and that's a contrast. Okay? So, although the concept of contrast and affinity of tone is easy to understand, it is surprisingly difficult to use. I'm quoting from the book. Middle gray tones often creep into contrasty shots of three-dimensional objects, eroding the tonal contrast. Affinity of tone is also tricky to maintain because darker and lighter tones are hard to remove. Color complicates our ability to evaluate tone because it distracts our attention. Reduce or removing color makes evaluating tone much easier. So to control the tone in production, you want to use your art direction. You find the subject. You must know where you want the audience to look. And if there's no movement, because if there's any movement, that's gonna get our attention first. But now we have to be aware of where we're placing the brightest objects. Okay, we find the subject. Are we going to conceal that subject? Are we going to reveal the subject? Are we going to use coincidence or non-coincidence? Don't confuse, the next thing is don't confuse color with tone. That's a big mistake. We see a bright red and we think, oh, it's tone. No, it's not. That's color. Tone has to do with brightness of the object. Okay? You evaluate the color, the tone, by disregarding the color information. Okay? Shoot a black and white test photograph with a black and white monitor to accurately judge the lighting. Okay? Are you going to hide or reveal? Coincidence or non-coincidence? Okay? That's how you control tone during the during production. And now he gives us a bunch of films to watch. One of them is T-Men, Raw Deal, Kill Bill, The Conformist, Repulsion, and Manhattan. So, also this week, I'm dropping the written essay. So I'm going to drop another video explaining to you guys what to look out for on your essay. All right? Have a good one.